No one took the crying bride at the station, until a rancher's son pointed, "That's my mama." The late afternoon sun lingered over the small train station, laying golden beams across the weathered boards and cracked benches. Dust rose each time the departing passengers' boots struck the ground, and the whistle of the engine faded into the horizon. Among the last to remain was a young woman, her white dress dulled by travel and her veil trembling in the light wind. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands clutching a bouquet that had begun to wilt. She looked down the road again and again, hoping for someone who never came. The townsfolk who had gathered to see the train unload began drifting away, whispering in clusters. Some looked at her with pity, others with judgment. The bride was clearly waiting for a groom who had not arrived. She pressed the back of her hand against her trembling lips to stifle the sobs, but the ache in her chest only deepened. Her suitcase rested at her side, heavy with all she owned, but heavier still was the truth dawning on her heart. No one had come to claim her. The station grew emptier, and the air thickened with silence. She sat down, her gown pooling around her, staring at her lap with vacant eyes. The bouquet slipped from her hands and landed on the wooden planks, petals scattering. She thought of the promises written in letters, the dreams of a new life whispered across ink pages. All had led her here, and yet she was abandoned like an unwanted parcel. She covered her face, and the sobs came, raw and unrestrained. It was then that a boy, no older than 10, tugged at his father's sleeve. The boy's eyes were wide, his dark hair ruffled by the wind, and in his gaze was both curiosity and certainty. He pointed at the weeping woman and said with a voice that cut through the murmurs of the few lingering witnesses, "That's my mama." The words struck the air like a bell. The rancher, a man of strong build and worn features, looked down at his son in surprise. "What are you saying, Caleb?" he asked, his voice deep and measured. The boy didn't falter. His finger remained outstretched, his face firm with conviction. "That's my mama," he repeated. "I know it." The bride lifted her head at the sound. Her swollen eyes met the boy's steady gaze, and something in her heart shifted. For a moment, the world stilled. She felt as though the boy had seen deeper into her pain than any adult could, as though he recognized a truth hidden even from herself. The rancher hesitated, torn between correcting his son and investigating the strange declaration. His boots echoed against the boards as he walked toward the woman. She flinched when his shadow fell over her, expecting mockery or scorn, but instead, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Ma'am, are you alone?" Her lips trembled as she tried to answer, but no words came. Only a nod. Tears welled again, blurring her vision. The man shifted, unsure of how to comfort a stranger in such distress. But Caleb stepped forward, leaving his father's side. He bent to pick up her fallen bouquet, then held it out to her with both hands. "Don't cry," he said softly. "You belong with us." The simplicity of the words struck deeper than the woman expected. She took the flowers back, her fingers brushing the boy's small hands, and for the first time that day, she felt warmth instead of emptiness. The rancher studied her, noting the way her dress clung to her frame, the weariness in her posture, the story written in every tear. "Were you supposed to meet someone here?" he asked. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Yes, he promised to marry me. But he never came." The confession broke something inside her, and the sobs threatened to return. The man's jaw tightened. He had seen deceit before, promises broken by men who cared little for the hearts they shattered. But the sight of her sitting alone in her wedding dress pierced him with an unfamiliar ache. Caleb looked up at his father expectantly, as if waiting for him to do what was right. Without thinking further, the rancher extended his hand to her. "You can't stay here alone. Come with us. We'll see that you're safe." She hesitated, her gaze flicking from his weathered hand to his son's hopeful eyes. Trust did not come easily after such betrayal, but the boy's certainty still echoed in her ears. "That's my mama." Slowly, almost fearfully, she placed her hand in his. The man helped her to her feet, steadying her as though she were fragile porcelain. Caleb grinned and took her other hand, as if sealing a bond already written in his heart. Together, they walked from the station, leaving behind the bouquet's scattered petals. The journey to the ranch was quiet, broken only by the sound of hooves and the evening breeze. The woman sat in the wagon, holding her veil close against the dust, her mind a storm of uncertainty. Yet every time she looked at Caleb, he smiled at her with unshaken conviction, and something deep inside her began to soften. When they reached the ranch, the sky was awash with hues of fire and gold. The sprawling fields stretched out endlessly, the fences casting long shadows. She stepped down from the wagon, her gown brushing against the earth, and felt the first stirrings of belonging. The boy took her hand again and led her toward the porch. "This is home," he said simply. The rancher stood back, watching the way his son clung to her, and felt the weight of an unspoken truth settle over him. Perhaps the boy saw what he himself could not yet name. Perhaps fate had drawn her here not to be forsaken, but to be found. The night deepened, and stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. Inside the warm glow of the ranch house, the bride, still in her wedding dress, sat at the table with the boy and his father. She listened to their laughter, to the crackle of the fire, and felt the ache in her chest begin to mend. For the first time since stepping off that train, she was not alone. And though the man had not said more than a handful of words to her, and though she still carried the sting of abandonment, she realized she had stumbled into something far greater than the life she thought she was promised. A boy had pointed at her with unshaken certainty and claimed her as his own. And in that claim, a new chapter had begun. The night was quiet, broken only by the sigh of the wind moving across the fields and the low murmur of cattle resting beyond the fences. The stars seemed endless, shining above the ranch house as if heaven itself leaned closer to witness the unexpected gathering within its walls. The young bride, still clothed in her faded white gown, sat at the wooden table where a lantern cast a warm glow upon her weary face. Caleb sat across from her, his hands busy breaking a piece of bread, while his father leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her in silence. She felt the heaviness of eyes upon her, the scrutiny of a man who measured carefully before he spoke. The kindness in the boy's eyes gave her comfort, but the father's steady gaze kept her tethered to her fears. She lowered her hands to her lap, twisting her fingers nervously, afraid that at any moment he might ask her to leave. Yet, when he finally spoke, his voice held no edge, only a slow weight that carried both strength and restraint. "You've had a hard day," he said. "Eat something. Rest tonight. Tomorrow, we'll see what's to be done." The words, simple as they were, felt like a lifeline. She picked up the bread Caleb had placed before her, and though her appetite was nearly gone, she forced herself to chew. Each bite grounded her, reminding her that she had not been left alone on that station platform. She glanced at Caleb, who watched her with a quiet pride, as if her very presence at the table had proven him right. After the meal, the rancher rose, his chair scraping softly against the floorboards. He lit another lamp and handed it to her. "You can take the spare room at the end of the hall," he said. "It's not much, but it's yours for the night." She accepted it with trembling hands, whispering, "Thank you." The hall smelled faintly of cedar, the boards creaking under her steps. When she opened the door to the small room, she found a narrow bed with a quilt folded neatly at the foot. The space was plain but clean, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness of the station. She set the lamp on the table and sat down, the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders until her back curved under it. She removed her veil and laid it across her lap, staring at the lace as though it held answers. The man who had promised her love had abandoned her, and yet a child had claimed her as his mother. She pressed her face into the veil and wept softly, though even through the tears she felt a strange warmth within her heart, something she hadn't expected to feel again. Morning came with the call of roosters and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window, falling across her gown in pale ribbons. She changed into a simpler dress from her suitcase, folded the wedding gown with careful hands, and carried it to the chest at the foot of the bed. As she laid it inside, she realized she was closing away not only the garment but also the dreams it once represented. When she stepped into the kitchen, Caleb's face lit up as if he had been waiting for her all along. "Mama," he cried, running to her with such joy that she nearly stumbled. She caught him in her arms, startled by the way the word poured from him with such conviction. Her eyes lifted to the rancher, whose expression remained guarded, though his silence spoke of his own quiet wonder at the bond already forming. Over breakfast, she told them her name, Eleanor Grace. Her voice wavered when she spoke it, for she felt as though she were introducing not just herself but also the broken story that had brought her here. The rancher introduced himself as Daniel Hayes, and his son Caleb beamed with pride at hearing the family name spoken aloud. Daniel did not pry into Eleanor's past, though he suspected pain lay behind her eyes. Instead, after the meal, he turned to Caleb. "Take Miss Eleanor around the ranch today. Show her the place." Caleb's grin spread wide. He tugged Eleanor's hand eagerly, leading her through the back door into the bright morning. She followed him past the barn, where horses nickered at their approach, and out to the pasture where cattle grazed lazily under the sky. Caleb chattered about everything: the horse he hoped to ride someday, the calf born last spring, the tree where he liked to sit and watch the sunset. His voice filled the air with life, and Eleanor listened with a smile that grew despite the shadows in her heart. As they walked, she felt the boy's small hand in hers, and though she had not chosen this path, she found herself holding onto him with an instinct she couldn't explain. He looked up at her with unshakable certainty, and she realized that, in his mind, the bond was already sealed. He had spoken truth at the station not because he knew her story, but because he had seen something she could not yet see herself. Later that day, Eleanor offered to help with chores. She swept the porch, washed the dishes, and even assisted with the laundry. Strung across the line, Daniel watched her quietly as she moved about the ranch house, her movements tentative but earnest. He could see she was not accustomed to ranch life, yet she worked with a determination that stirred respect in him. As dusk approached, Daniel found her standing by the corral, her gaze distant as the sky burned with color. He stepped beside her, resting one arm on the fence. "You're welcome here as long as you need," he said. She turned her face toward him, eyes glistening with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd have done if you hadn't taken me in," she whispered. Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. "Life has a way of testing us," he said. "But sometimes what seems like an ending is just a new beginning." The words lingered between them as the silence of evening fell. Caleb ran to them, breathless from play, and Eleanor bent to gather him into her arms. Daniel watched the two of them, the boy's laughter mingling with Eleanor's soft smile, and he felt something stir within him that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Days passed, then weeks, and Eleanor became woven into the fabric of life on the ranch. She rose with the dawn to help prepare breakfast, learned to mend fences with steady hands, and tended to the small garden with Caleb by her side. She began to laugh again, quiet at first, then brighter, until her voice filled the house with warmth. The pain of abandonment still lingered, but it no longer defined her. The ranch had given her something else: a place, a purpose, and a boy who looked at her as though she had always been his mother. The townsfolk, however, were not blind. Whispers spread about the crying bride who had been taken in by Daniel Hayes. Some judged, others speculated, but none could deny the way Eleanor carried herself with quiet dignity, nor the way Daniel stood by her with unspoken strength. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Eleanor sat with Daniel on the porch. The wind tugged at her hair, and thunder rolled in the distance. She glanced at him, her heart pounding with words she had not dared to speak. "Do you think Caleb really believes I'm his mama?" she asked. Daniel looked at her then, his eyes steady and unwavering. "He doesn't just believe it," he said. "He knows it, and truth be told, I think he might be right." Her breath caught, the storm around them echoing the storm within her. She had been abandoned, yes, but she had been claimed in a way that no letter or promise could rival. Caleb had spoken a truth that was shaping her life, and Daniel's quiet strength had sheltered her in the midst of despair. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavy, drumming against the roof. Eleanor stood there, feeling the cool drops on her skin, and for the first time since she had stepped off that train, she did not feel like a bride left behind. She felt like a woman found, not by the man who had promised her a future, but by the family who had given her a home. And as lightning lit the sky, she held on to the boy who called her Mama, and stood beside the man whose silence spoke more than words. The storm raged on, but within her heart there was peace, and within that peace, the beginning of a love she had never imagined. The storm passed slowly through the night, and when morning came the air was crisp, washed clean by rain. The ranch smelled of damp earth and fresh grass, and water glistened in every groove of the fence rails. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, the hem of her dress brushing against the boards as she inhaled the sharp scent of renewal. She felt as though the land itself had taken a deep breath and begun again, and somehow, she too was beginning again. Caleb bounded from the barn, his boots splashing through puddles, his laughter ringing like music in the morning air. He ran to her and tugged at her hand. "Come see, Mama, the creek is full." His voice, bright and unrestrained, wrapped around her heart and pulled her forward. She followed him down to the stream that curved along the ranch's edge. The water rushed swift and high, carrying broken branches and leaves along its surface. Caleb knelt at the bank, poking a stick into the current to test its strength. "Be careful," Eleanor warned, her voice carrying both tenderness and a depth of care that surprised even herself. The word Mama still startled her each time it slipped from his lips, but it was no longer strange. Instead, it rooted deeper into her heart, settling into a place that had been empty for so long she hadn't realized it needed filling. Daniel approached on horseback, leading another mare behind him. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the wet ground. "Thought you might like to ride today," he said, nodding toward the second horse. Eleanor hesitated, shaking her head. "I've never." "Then it's time to learn," Daniel said, matter of fact, as though it was already decided. He led the horse closer and held the reins out to her. Caleb jumped up, eyes bright with excitement. "Yes, Mama, you'll love it." Reluctantly, Eleanor placed her hand on the reins. The horse shifted, its breath warm against her palm, and fear trembled in her chest. Daniel's steady presence calmed her. He guided her step by step, his hand at her elbow as he helped her mount. She clutched the horn of the saddle, her knuckles white, but Daniel's calm voice steadied her nerves. "Look ahead, not down. Trust the horse. Trust yourself." The rhythm of the mare beneath her was strange at first, jarring, but gradually she adjusted. The breeze lifted her hair, and the ranch stretched wide before her, open and endless. Caleb rode beside them on a pony, laughing as he urged it forward. Daniel rode at her other side, quiet but watchful, his presence like an anchor. For the first time since arriving, Eleanor felt something more than refuge. She felt freedom. When they returned to the barn, she slid from the saddle, her legs trembling but her smile genuine. Daniel took the reins from her hands, his fingers brushing hers briefly. That small touch carried more than words, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. She turned away quickly, busying herself with smoothing her skirt, but the memory of his hand lingered. The days wove into one another, each bringing a rhythm Eleanor had not known she could embrace. She cooked with Caleb's eager help, learned the names of each horse in the stable, and planted herbs by the porch with soil still rich from the storm. The land demanded hard work, yet it gave back in peace, and she found herself stronger than she had ever imagined. But whispers followed her when she ventured into town. Women at the mercantile exchanged knowing glances, and men muttered at the saloon. They said she had been abandoned, left a spectacle in her wedding dress, only to be taken in by a widowed rancher. Some pitied her, others judged, but all watched. Eleanor bore their stares with quiet dignity, though inside, the shame still pricked her like thorns. One afternoon, as she folded laundry on the porch, Daniel stepped beside her. "I know what folks are saying," he said bluntly. She stilled, her hands freezing over a shirt. He looked out over the fields, his jaw set. "But their words don't matter here. What matters is the life we build inside these walls." Eleanor swallowed, her throat tight. "I don't want to bring trouble on you and Caleb." Daniel turned his eyes to her then, steady and unwavering. "You're not trouble, Eleanor. You're an answer to something I didn't know I needed." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She lowered her gaze quickly, but her heart pounded with a rhythm she couldn't ignore. As autumn spread across the land, the air grew sharp, and the leaves turned amber and gold. Eleanor wrapped scarves around Caleb before he ran out to play, her hands mothering him with instinct born not of blood but of love. At night, she read to him by lamplight until his eyes drooped, and he curled against her as though he had always known her arms. Daniel often watched from the doorway, silent, his face softened by a warmth he tried not to show. Yet, despite the peace that grew between them, shadows of the past still lingered. One evening, a letter arrived at the ranch. The envelope bore a familiar hand, one that made Eleanor's stomach twist. She carried it to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her name written across it. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and she read the words of the man who had left her stranded. He wrote of regret, of circumstances that had forced him away, of promises broken but hearts still bound. He claimed he would come for her, that he had not forgotten. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She crumpled the letter, fury and sorrow colliding within her. That night, she could not sleep. She stepped out onto the porch, the cool air stinging her cheeks. Daniel was there, sitting in the shadows, his eyes catching the lantern glow. He didn't ask, but somehow he knew. He wrote to you. She nodded, unable to speak. Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Do you want to go back to him? The question pierced her, and she clutched the railing for strength. I don't know, she whispered. Once, he was my whole future. But now, her voice broke. Now I don't know who I am without Caleb, without this place. Daniel rose and stepped closer, his presence filling the space around her. Then maybe you already have your answer, he said quietly. Their eyes met, and in the silence between them was something unspoken but undeniable. Eleanor felt the weight of her past, but she also felt the pull of something deeper, a belonging she had never known, a love not promised in letters but built in the steady rhythm of shared days. Winter arrived, wrapping the ranch in frost and snow. The hearth burned bright each night, and laughter warmed the rooms despite the chill outside. Eleanor sewed quilts with Caleb, her hands steady as he clumsily tried to mimic her stitches. Daniel repaired tools in the barn, his breath misting in the cold air. Together, they endured the season, a family bound not by circumstance but by choice. Still, the letter lay hidden in Eleanor's chest, a reminder of the road not taken, a whisper of the man who had once promised her forever. But each day, as she watched Caleb grow and felt Daniel's quiet strength at her side, the past seemed to fade, replaced by a present more real than any dream. The ranch became her home. The boy became her son. And the man who had once been only a stranger at a train station became the anchor of her soul. And though the world beyond their fences might still whisper, Eleanor no longer listened. She had been left alone in a white dress, but she had been found in the dust and silence of a station where a child's voice had declared a truth that reshaped her life. That truth echoed still, with every laugh, every shared meal, every quiet evening by the fire. That's my mama. The snow melted slowly under the first hints of spring, dripping from the eaves of the ranch house and softening the frozen earth into dark, rich soil. The world awakened around Eleanor as though the land itself was eager to start anew. Green buds pushed through branches, and calves tottered on shaky legs in the fields. Caleb ran among them with uncontainable joy, his laughter ringing out like a bell. Eleanor watched from the porch, her hands folded against her apron, her heart swelling with a tenderness so deep it frightened her. Life had settled into a rhythm she had not imagined possible when she first stepped off that train in her wedding gown. Each day began before the sun with the sounds of roosters crowing and Daniel's boots on the floorboards. Together they worked, the endless labor of the ranch never ceasing, but within the labor there was peace. Eleanor found herself humming as she kneaded bread, smiling as she hung laundry under the open sky, laughing as Caleb tugged at her sleeve with endless questions. Yet even in the midst of contentment, shadows stirred. The letter still rested in the bottom of her chest, hidden beneath folded garments, its words like thorns pricking her whenever she remembered them. The man who had once promised her love had written that he would come, and though months had passed with no sign, she could not silence the fear that he might appear and shatter the fragile peace she had found. One afternoon, while Daniel was repairing a fence line, Eleanor took a pail of water out to him. She stood for a moment watching the strength of his arms as he worked, the surety of his movements, the steadiness that had become the foundation of her new life. He glanced up, his eyes catching hers, and for an instant the air between them thickened with something unspoken. He took the pail from her hands, their fingers brushing, and she felt the warmth travel up her arm to her heart. You've taken to this place, Daniel said, his voice low. Eleanor nodded, her eyes lingering on him. It feels like I belong here, she admitted, the words surprising her with their truth. His gaze softened, and though he said nothing more, she saw in his eyes the reflection of feelings he had not yet dared to voice. The days stretched into longer light as spring deepened, and with it, Eleanor's heart began to untangle itself from the pain of her past. Caleb's unwavering certainty, "That's my mama," had woven her into their lives, and Daniel's steady presence had given her roots. But fate is seldom content to let peace remain untested. It was a market day when the past returned. Eleanor had gone into town with Caleb, her basket filled with eggs and butter to trade. The square was busy, filled with wagons and voices, and she felt the usual prickle of eyes upon her. She walked with her head high, Caleb skipping beside her, when a voice froze her where she stood. Eleanor. She turned, her breath catching. There he was, the man from the letters, the one who had left her abandoned at the station. His hat shadowed his face, but his eyes held the same glimmer that had once promised her the world. He stepped closer, his smile hesitant. "I've come for you, just like I said." Her heart pounded, a storm rising within her. Caleb tightened his grip on her hand, his eyes narrowing at the stranger. Eleanor's voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Why now? After all this time?" The man reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "I was delayed. Business, debts, things I couldn't control. But I never stopped thinking of you. You were meant to be my bride." Caleb's small voice cut through the tension, sharp and certain. "She's not your bride. She's my mama." The man blinked, taken aback, his gaze flicking to the boy and then back to Eleanor. Confusion darkened his features. "What is this? Who is he?" Before Eleanor could answer, a shadow fell across them. Daniel had come, his tall frame filling the space beside her, his hand resting with quiet possession on the small of her back. His eyes met the stranger's with a calm that carried an undercurrent of warning. "She belongs with us," Daniel said evenly. The man scoffed, his pride bristling. "I made her a promise long before you. She came here for me." Eleanor's heart twisted. The truth of his words stung, for once she had clung to those promises with all her hope. But as she looked at him now, she saw the hollowness behind his eyes, the instability that had left her abandoned. Then she looked at Caleb, whose small hand clung to hers with unyielding trust, and at Daniel, whose steady presence had been her refuge. In that moment, clarity settled over her like sunlight breaking through clouds. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I came here for you, but you weren't there. You left me alone, and when you did, they found me. Caleb claimed me. Daniel gave me shelter, and I have found my home." The man's face tightened, his eyes flashing with anger and disbelief. "You would choose them over me?" Eleanor lifted her chin, strength flowing through her. "I would choose the ones who didn't abandon me." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Caleb's small but triumphant voice. "I told you, she's my mama," the man muttered under his breath, turned on his heel, and vanished into the crowd. Eleanor's knees trembled, but Daniel's arm steadied her. He guided her and Caleb back to the wagon, his touch firm, protective, and filled with an unspoken promise. That night, Eleanor stood on the porch beneath a sky scattered with stars. Daniel joined her, his presence quiet but strong. She turned to him, her heart full of words she could no longer hold. "I was once a bride left behind," she whispered. "But here, with you and Caleb, I've found something greater. I've found a family." Daniel's eyes held hers, steady and sure. He reached for her hand, enclosing it in his. "And I've found the woman I didn't know my heart was waiting for." Caleb's voice called from the doorway, sleepy but certain. "Good night, Mama. Good night, Papa." The words settled over them like a blessing, binding them in a truth deeper than any vow. Eleanor leaned into Daniel, her heart finally at rest. She had been abandoned, but she was no longer lost. She had been claimed not by promises on paper, but by love lived out in the dust and light of every day. And as the night stretched white around them, Eleanor knew the boy had spoken the truest words of all at that lonely station. She was his mama, and this was her home. The ranch seemed different after that day in town, as though some invisible weight had lifted. The man from Eleanor's past had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving no trace but the echo of his voice in her memory. Yet instead of grief, she felt a strange calmness settle over her. For the first time, she understood that her heart no longer belonged to the promises of letters or the man who had left her behind. It belonged here, to the land, to the boy who had claimed her, and to the man whose silence carried more strength than any vow. Days turned into weeks, and spring spread its fullness across the fields. Eleanor rose with the dawn, working the fields. Eleanor rose with the dawn, working side by side with Daniel and Caleb, and with each passing day, the threads of her old life unraveled until they were nothing more than shadows. What remained was a new fabric, woven of laughter at the dinner table, of Caleb's small arms wrapped around her neck, of Daniel's steady presence when the nights grew quiet. One evening, when the horizon burned with the colors of sunset, Daniel stood with Eleanor on the porch. The cattle lowed in the distance, and Caleb's voice drifted from the barn where he was putting away tools. Daniel's hand rested against the railing, his shoulders square as always, but there was a tension in his jaw that told her he had been holding something back. "You had a choice in town," he said at last, his voice deep and low. "You could have left with him." Eleanor turned her gaze to him, her heart tightening. "I never wanted to leave," she said softly. "I only wanted to be seen, to be chosen. And when he didn't come for me, I thought my life was over. But Caleb saw me. You gave me a place to belong. That's more than any promise could have ever given me." Daniel's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. "You belong here, Eleanor. Not because you were left behind, but because you were found. And because this place, it needs you. Caleb needs you. And," his voice caught for the first time, rough with emotion, "and I need you." Tears filled her eyes, but they were not the bitter tears of abandonment. They were the tears of a woman who had finally been seen, finally been loved for who she truly was. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they laced with his. "Then I am yours," she whispered. At that moment, Caleb burst onto the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "Papa, Mama, come quick." He grabbed their hands and pulled them toward the barn. Inside, a mare had gone into labor, and within moments a new foal struggled to its feet, wet and unsteady but alive. Caleb clapped his hands in delight, his laughter filling the air. Eleanor and Daniel stood side by side, watching life unfold before them, and it felt like a sign from heaven itself. Something new had begun, fragile but strong, and it belonged to them. In the days that followed, word of Eleanor's choice spread through town. Some continued to whisper, but most fell silent when they saw the quiet strength of the Hayes family. No rumor could undo the truth that was plain to anyone who watched them together. Eleanor was no longer a bride abandoned. She was a wife in spirit, a mother in truth, and a cornerstone of the ranch. One Sunday, Daniel hitched the wagon and drove them into town for church. Eleanor sat beside him, Caleb between them, his small hand clutching hers. As they entered the chapel, heads turned, but Daniel's hand brushed against her back, steadying her. The pastor welcomed them with a smile, and for the first time, Eleanor did not feel the sting of eyes upon her. She felt only the strength of belonging, of standing not alone but as part of a family. After the service, Caleb tugged at Daniel's sleeve and whispered something in his ear. Daniel's lips curved in the smallest of smiles, and he nodded. Then, with the boldness only a child could carry, Caleb stood before the small gathering and announced, "This is my mama, and this is my papa. And we're a family now." Laughter rippled through the congregation, but it was warm, touched with something deeper than humor. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but when she looked at Daniel, his eyes held hers with quiet affirmation. In that moment, she realized she no longer feared what others thought. The truth was written in the boy's voice, in the man's steady gaze, in the life they were building together. That evening, back at the ranch, Daniel stood with Eleanor beneath the wide sky. The stars glimmered above them, and the air carried the scent of earth and wildflowers. He took her hands in his touch rough but tender. "Eleanor Grace," he said, his voice firm, "you were never meant to be left behind. You were meant to be here, with me, with us." Her breath caught, and tears shimmered in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "this is where I was meant to be." Daniel leaned forward, and for the first time, their lips met, a kiss not of hurried passion but of steady promise, a sealing of what had already been written in the quiet bonds of their days. Caleb's voice drifted from the porch, soft and content, "Good night, Mama." "Good night, Papa." Eleanor smiled through her tears, leaning into Daniel's embrace. She had come to this land as a bride forsaken, abandoned at a station with nothing but a dress and broken dreams. But here, in the arms of a man who stood like an anchor and a boy whose heart had claimed her with a single word, she had found a new beginning. The past no longer haunted her. The whispers no longer mattered. The station, the tears, the wilted bouquet, all of it had led her here, to the place where love had found her in its truest form. She was no longer a crying bride. She was a mother. She was a wife in spirit. She was home. And under the vast sky of the ranch, Eleanor knew with a certainty that no storm, no whisper, no memory could shake. She had not been abandoned. She had been chosen. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.